The chamber smelled like every species. At once, that was the first thing human ambassadors always noticed about the Grand Council Hall on Vithara Station. The smell. 40 years of alien bodies, alien breath. Alien food brought in through side doors. And eaten quietly during the long sessions. The recycled air mixed it all together into something that had no name. In any language, most humans found it difficult. Elder Dara Sen had stopped noticing it 17 years ago. She sat at the small table assigned to humanity. It was near the back. It had always been near the back. The council seating was arranged by military contribution, by resource output, by how many systems a species controlled. Humanity controlled 4 out of roughly 900 charted. Their table was near the back, slightly to the left, partially behind one of the great stone columns that held up the hall's curved ceiling. You could see the main floor from there, but only at an angle. You could hear everything, but you had to lean forward slightly to see the faces of the speakers. Dara Sen did not lean forward. She sat straight. She had a cup of tea. She waited. The hall was full. That was unusual. Normally, the council sessions drew representatives and their immediate aides, a few hundred bodies filling the wide curved rows of seats that descended toward the central floor like an ancient theater. Today there were nearly 2,000. Word had spread. The crafted sent a formal declaration 3 days ago, and the council had scheduled an emergency session. And everyone who could get to Vithara Station in time had come. They wanted to see the humans receive their terms. Dara Sen drank her tea. The craft delegation entered from the East Passage, which was the passage reserved for major military powers. There were 11 of them. They wore their formal armor, the deep red-black plates that covered them from neck to ankle, the shoulder ridges that added half a meter to their already considerable height. Craft were large. They were built wide and low, with necks that sat forward on their shoulders and eyes the pale yellow of old bone. They walked with a heaviness that was not clumsiness. It was authority. It was the walk of a species that had won enough wars that walking into a room felt like winning another one. Their head delegate was named Vash Creel. He was not their most senior military commander. That would have been inappropriate, sending military to a political session. But he was their most senior diplomat, which in craft terms meant he was the one best at making threats sound like courtesy. He had a long scar along the left side of his jaw that he had never explained and never needed to. He sat at the craft table, which was at the front, slightly right of center, and he looked across the hall toward Dara Sen's table. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that had teeth in it. Dara Sen looked at him, then she looked at her tea. The session was called to order by the council chair, a Valorian named Asik, who had held the position for 6 years, and who managed the difficult art of appearing neutral while secretly exhausted by everyone. Asik called the room to attention with 3 strikes of the ceremonial rod on the resonance plate, a sound that carried through the halls, acoustics, and landed in the chest rather than the ears. The room settled. Asik read the formal statement of purpose. The Krath Empire had filed a territorial adjustment claim under Article 9 of the Galactic Compact, the article that allowed expanding powers to formally absorb underdefended regions when a species could not demonstrate adequate Protection capacity. The human colonies of Reach 7 and Reach 8, located in the Savory Drift, had been designated as qualifying territories. He did not say burned. The formal language never said burned. Darrison knew what Reach 7 and Reach 8 looked like now. She had seen the survey images. She had looked at them once, alone in her office, and then she had put them away and not looked at them again. There was nothing useful in looking at them again. Reach 7 had been home to about 400,000 people. Reach 8 had been a younger colony, still growing, about 90,000. They had been farming settlements, mostly grain and protein crops adapted for the local soil. People who got up early and worked until the light went and ate dinner with their families. The Krath had burned them from orbit. It had taken less than a day. The formal language called it a territorial adjustment. Asik finished reading and invited Vash Creel to present the Empire's position. Vash Creel stood. He was good at standing. He filled the space in front of him in a way that suggested the space had been built for him. He spoke in compact standard, which every registered species was required to learn. His accent was thick, but his vocabulary was precise. The Krath had always been better at the language of law than they let on. He said that the Krath Empire regret the disruption to the Savory Drift region. He said that the human settlements had been operating without adequate defense infrastructure, which posed a risk to regional stability. He said that the Empire had taken necessary steps to secure the area and was prepared to offer fair compensation in the form of resource credits to the Earth Coalition for the inconvenience. Inconvenience. He said the word without any change in his expression. He had practiced it that way. He said that the Empire was prepared to also extend its protection to humanity's remaining 2 colonies in the adjacent region, Reach 4 and Reach 6, as a gesture of goodwill, provided that the Earth Coalition formally recognized Cathar authority in the Savory Drift within 30 standard days. He sat down. The hall buzzed. The buzz had a texture to it, the particular quality of sound that happens when a room full of people are performing surprise at something they expected. A few of the delegations near the front exchanged looks. Vethasi representatives who controlled 6 systems and had their own complicated history with the Cathar looked carefully at nothing. The Drakesea cluster's 3 delegates whispered among themselves. The Veloxi, small insect-bodied, perched on their elevated seats at the far left, were still. Asik asked if the Earth Coalition wished to respond. Darrison stood up. She was not tall. She was 63 years old and had the build of someone who had spent decades sitting at tables exactly like this one. Her hair was white at the temples and pulled back simply. She wore the Earth Coalition's formal colors, dark blue with a single gold stripe at the collar that indicated senior ambassador rank. She had no armor. She had no delegation behind her. She had come alone, which was permitted, but unusual, and which some delegations had already noted and discussed quietly among themselves. She said good morning to the council. She thanked Asik for the session. She thanked the Cathar delegation for attending. Then she paused. It was not a nervous pause. It was not a pause that asked for silence. It was the kind of pause that already had silence and was simply deciding what to do with it. She said that the Earth Coalition understood the Karath Empire's position clearly. She said that she was sure the Empire had reviewed humanity's known military assets before submitting their claim. The public records were available after all to any registered council member. She said she was sure the numbers were not impressive. They were not. The Earth Coalition's registered fleet consisted of 41 ships. The largest was a carrier vessel called the * Providence that was, by galactic standards, medium-sized at best. Their weapon systems were rated at Tier 3 on the standard scale. Karath operated at Tier 7. Most council members, if they were honest, ranked humanity somewhere between a diplomatic curiosity and a minor trade partner, a species that had been given a seat at the table mostly because refusing them would have looked impolite. Vash Karath was looking at her with an expression that was almost gentle, the expression of someone watching something small try to be brave. Dara Sin looked back at him. She said, I want to ask the council one question before I respond formally. I want to ask why, in 200 years of galactic registration, humanity never built a larger fleet. The room was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes when a question sounds simple but no one immediately knows the answer. She said, every species here that has reviewed our record will know that humanity has the industrial capacity, we have the resources, we have the technical knowledge, we have held Tier 6 engineering certification for 80 years, we have the population, we have had on multiple occasions the motive. She looked around the room slowly. She was not performing the look, she was actually looking at each delegation in turn, meeting eyes where eyes could be met, acknowledging each presence. She said, you should have asked why we never built bigger. Someone should have asked that question a long time ago. Then she sat down. The buzz in the room was different this time. It did not have the texture of performed surprise. It had something else in it, something that took a moment to identify. Vash Creel's expression had not changed, but he had straightened slightly in his seat, just slightly. In a craft diplomat of his experience, it was the equivalent of taking a step back. Asek looked between the two delegations. He asked if the Earth Coalition was formally contesting the territorial adjustment claim. Darrison said yes. Asek noted the contest for the record and announced that a 30-day deliberation period would begin, during which both parties would submit formal documentation. Standard procedure. He struck the resonance plate twice, which meant the session was paused but not closed, and the hall began to shift and murmur as delegations turned to each other. Darrison picked up her tea. It had gone cold. The Veloxy ambassador, whose name was Chicory Vass and who was small enough to fit in a human's carry bag, moved from the Veloxy table to the column nearest Darrison's position and waited until the noise of the room covered the distance between them. Chicory Vass did not come to the table. She stayed at the column, her many-jointed hands folded in front of her compound eyes catching the chamber light. She said very quietly, Elder Sin, that was a very careful answer. Darrison said, thank you. Chicory Vass said, it was not a compliment, it was an observation. She paused. We have been watching humanity for a long time. We trade with you. We know your shipping routes, your resource imports, your declared production outputs. Another pause. There are Gaps, there have always been gaps. Resources that went somewhere that does not appear on any registered manifest. Darasin looked at her tea. Chikri Vas said, "We never asked, it was not our business to ask, but I want you to know that we noticed." She unfolded her hands and turned to go back to her table. Then she stopped. She said, without turning around, "I hope the answer to your question when it comes is a good one." She walked away. Darasin sat alone at the small table. Near the column, the hall noise swelled. Around her, 2,000 voices with 2,000 reactions to what had just happened. Most of them wrong. Her aide, a young man named Torin, who was 26 and had been working with her for 2 years and who had the good sense to stay quiet during important moments, appeared at her shoulder and asked if she wanted a fresh tea. She said yes. While he went to get it, she looked at the time display on her personal communicator, not at the date or the hour, at the seconds. She watched them tick, somewhere very far away, further than any galactic scanner had ever looked, further than any craft patrol had ever ventured in the dark between charted space and the empty regions that no one had bothered to name. Something was moving. It had been moving for 11 days. It was very large. It was not alone. Torvin came back with the tea. She thanked him. She drank it. It was the right temperature this time. She looked at the craft table where Vash Creel was receiving a briefing from one of his aides on a hand screen, probably already drafting the documentation for the deliberation period. He was a thorough diplomat. She had always respected that about him, the way you could respect a sharp edge. He looked up once and caught her eye. Across the room, she held his gaze. She did not smile. Their snorts was nothing in her face that was unkind or angry or afraid. There was just patience, deep, settled, completely untroubled patience, the kind that does not come from confidence in an argument, the kind that comes from knowing something the other person does not. Vash Creel looked away first. In the far dark of uncharted space, the thing that was moving had no lights on. Its hull, it did not need them. It had been built in the dark, and it knew the dark the way a person knows their own house, without looking, without thinking, purely by the feel of where everything was. It was not in a hurry. It had been built by people who understood that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not speed or firepower or the size of a fleet. It was patience. 200 years of it. At the edge of craft-patrolled space, Border Scout ship ran its standard sweep, 2 crew members, a third asleep. In the back, the sweep was routine. It had been routine for 6 years. The scanner painted the dark in all directions and found the same things. It always found empty space, a distant dust cloud, the faint radiation signature of a dead star 3 light years out. Then the scanner found something else. The crew member on duty looked at the reading, then looked again. He tapped the screen to make sure it was not a calibration error. It was not a calibration error. He said, "What is that?" His partner leaned over and looked. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The reading made no sense. The scanner was designed to identify objects, ships, stations, debris fields, celestial bodies. It placed everything into a category. It had been designed by craft engineers and tested against every known type of object in cataloged space. The object the scanner was now reading did not fit into any category. Not because it was a new type of ship. Because it was too large to be a ship. The scanner kept trying to categorize. It kept failing. It defaulted after several seconds of processing to the only category large enough to contain the object's mass reading. Planetary body. But planetary bodies did not move. The crew member reached for the emergency communication panel. His hand was on the transmit key. The object moved closer. Then another appeared beside it. Then another. He did not transmit. There was not time to transmit. There was only time to look at the view screen as the darkness in front of the border scout ship stopped being darkness and became something else. Entirely something that filled the screen from edge to edge, something that had no edge he could find, something that his brain kept insisting was a planet, but that his instincts, his old, deep, pre-rational instincts recognized as something built, something that had been waiting, something that was done waiting now. Fleet Admiral Grevak had never been afraid of the dark. He had grown up on Krathais Prime in the southern continent where the nights lasted 40 hours and the sky had no moon. Worth mentioning, he had learned to navigate dark spaces. As a child, caves, tunnels, the long, unlit corridors of the military academy, where the power was cut every third night as a training exercise. Darkness was just the absence of information. You moved through it the same way you moved through light, you just paid more attention. He stood on the command bridge of the Iron Verdict the Krath Empire's largest active warship, and he looked at the dark on his view screen, and for the first time in his life he felt the dark looking back. The Iron Verdict was not a small ship. It was 4 km long, a dreadnought-class vessel that had served as the Empire's fleet flagship for 22 years. It carried 800 crew, 300 combat personnel, and enough firepower to reduce a city to flat glass in under an hour. It had been in 11 engagements. It had never taken significant damage, though Krath considered it with some justification the most dangerous thing in this region of space. Grevak had been proud of that. He was revising his position. The emergency transmission from the border scout, fragmented, half-delivered, cut off mid-sentence, had reached the nearest Krath military station 4 hours ago. By the time Grevak had been woken, briefed, and had his fleet of 300 warships already moving, the scout's position was dark. No follow-up signal, no emergency beacon. Not destroyed, the scout had simply stopped transmitting, which was somehow worse than destruction because it meant whoever was out there had not needed to destroy anything. They had simply arrived, and the scout had gone quiet the way a person goes quiet when they see something that takes all the words away. 300 ships, that was what Grevak had brought. 300 was enough to take a planet. 300 was enough to hold a sector. 300 was, by any measure available to the Kraft military, a serious and overwhelming response to any threat they had ever faced or expected to face in this region of space. He had brought 300 ships because the sensor reading forwarded from the station had listed multiple large contacts, and Grevak was not a man who underestimated. He planned for the high, and he brought more than he thought he needed, because that was how you won. His tactical officer, a young craft named Veth, who had graduated top of her class and who Grevak had personally requested for this posting, was standing at her station with both hands on the console, not operating it, just resting on it the way you put your hands on something solid when the floor feels uncertain. Grevek noticed that. He said nothing about it. The fleet dropped out of transit speed at the coordinates from the scout's last transmission, and the view screens came live, and the bridge went quiet. Not the quiet of discipline, not the trained quiet of a military crew holding formation, the quiet of 250 intelligent people looking at something their minds could not immediately process, and defaulting in the absence of any adequate response to silence. Grevek looked at the screen. He had been briefed on the scouts sensor readings. He had seen the mass numbers. He had done the math on what mass numbers that size implied in terms of object volume, and the math had produced answers that he had mentally set aside because they were not useful answers. They were the kind of answers that came from a sensor malfunction or a calibration error, not from reality. Reality, it turned out, did not care what was useful. The thing on the screen was not a ship. His brain said it again. It was not a ship. Ships had defined edges. Ships had proportions that made sense relative to the space around them. Ships were things you could look at and locate. You could find the front, find the engines, find the weapons arrays, orient yourself relative to the thing, and understand where you were in relation to it. This thing, the first one, the one directly ahead, filled the screen from edge to edge and still had no edges. It was dark against the dark, visible only because it blocked the stars behind it. A shape cut out of the sky, and it was not blocking a small piece of the sky. It was blocking an enormous piece of it. A piece so large that grave fleet of 300 ships spread in standard engagement formation across 200 km of space was collectively looking at something that their combined spread did not match the width of. And that was just the first one. His sensor officer said very carefully, in the tone of someone who has checked their reading 3 times and does not want to say the number out loud, but is going to anyway. Admiral, I have 11 contacts, all confirmed, solid mass, all at this location. Grevek said, classification. The sensor officer said, the system is not classifying them, sir. Grevek said, override to manual, give me the mass readings. The numbers came up on his personal display. He read them. Again, he looked at the view screen. He looked back at the numbers. The smallest of the 11 objects had a mass reading consistent with a small moon. The largest, the one directly ahead, the one that had taken the stars away, read closer to a mid-sized planet. He stood very still for a moment. On Snort's a craft face. Stillness was not neutral. Stillness meant the mind was doing something the body was waiting on. Then he said, weapons hot, all ships. Veth looked at him just for a second. Then she said, yes, Admiral, and her hands moved on the console. 300 ships brought their weapons online. The electromagnetic signature of that many weapon systems activating simultaneously was significant enough that any scanner within 2 light hours would register it immediately. Grevek waited. The 11 objects did not move. They did not power weapons. They did not change formation. They did not respond in any way that Grevek had a word for. They simply stayed where they were, filling most of the sky in front of his fleet, and did nothing at all. He had fought 30 engagements in his career. He had fought species that screamed, threats over open channels, and species that attacked without any communication at all. He had never fought anything that simply waited after weapons came online. Waiting was not a military behavior. Waiting meant you were not afraid of what the other side had just done. His communications officer said, "Admiral, incoming transmission. It is from Lap Oz, sir. It is originating from the largest contact." Grevek said, "Put it through." The voice that came over the channel was human, female, older. It was a calm voice, not the performed calm of someone controlling fear, but the deep settled calm of someone who had been calm for a long time and saw no reason to change that. It spoke in compact standard with the human accent that Grevek had heard before in trade negotiations and council recordings, and had always found slightly flat compared to the richer tonal variation of Krath's speech. It said, "Fleet Admiral Grevek, my name is Admiral Maravas of the Earth Coalition Defense Command. I am transmitting from the command bridge of the Everest asterisk." Grevek said, "Admiral Vass, you are in Krath patrolled space without notification or permission. Identify your vessels and state your purpose." A pause, not a hesitation, a considered pause. The voice said, "I am going to read you some numbers, Admiral. I would like you to listen to all of them before you respond." Grevek said nothing. He waited. The voice said, "Colony reached 7. Population at last census, 412,840. Established 61 years ago. Primary industry agricultural. Reach 7 had the highest per capita birth rate of any human colony in the Sevri Drift. It was full of children, Admiral." A pause. Colony reach 8. Population at last census 80, 9,217. Established 23 years ago, still growing. They had just broken ground on a second township 3 months before your fleet arrived. Another pause. Combined loss, 502,057. People recorded over 19 hours. I have the full sensor logs from our observation satellites. I have everything, Admiral. I have it all. Grevek's jaw tightened. He said those territories were processed under Article 9 of the Galactic Compact. The action was legal. The voice said, "Yes, I know. I am not calling you to discuss law." Another pause. "I am calling to make sure that you understand what 500,000 people is. I want you to hold that number because I want to explain to you what you are looking at." Grevek waited. "What you are looking at," the voice said, "is what 500,000 people costs." Silence on the channel. "Then you are also looking at what 200 years of patience costs when it finally runs out. I thought you should hear that from me directly rather than have your crew try to explain it to you. They are going to have difficulty with the numbers." Grevek looked at Veth. She was looking at her console. On the screen, the mass readings were still up. He looked at them again, and he thought about 300 ships, and he thought about the number 200 years, and something moved through his chest that he did not have a good word for. He said, "Admiral Veth, I have 300 warships at your position. I would encourage you to." "I know," she said. "I watched you come in. You brought more than I expected. That was wise of you." A pause. "It will not matter, but it was wise." Grevek said, "Fire solution. Target the primary contact." Veth said, "Admiral," she stopped. He said, "Report." She said, and he could hear something in her voice that he had never heard from her before, something careful and precise and very quiet. "Sir, I cannot generate a targeting solution for the primary contact. Our targeting system operates by identifying a target's edges and locking relative to its center mass. The primary contact's edges are outside the range of our targeting grid." Grevak looked at the screen. He said, "What does that mean?" Veth said, "It means the object is too large for the system to frame. We cannot lock on. There is nothing for the lock to hold." She paused. "Sir, it is like trying to target a planet. You would have to calculate a specific impact point manually and fire on coordinates, not on a lock." He stood very still again. Then he said, "Calculate coordinates. Center hull, all ships manual fire. Coordinated strike." Veth said, "Yes, Admiral." It took 4 minutes to calculate and distribute the coordinates. 4 minutes, during which the 11 objects in front of his fleet continued to do nothing at all. No movement, no communication after the initial transmission. The Everest, if that vast dark shape was the asterisk Everest, simply existed in the space ahead of him and waited. When the strike came, it was everything 300 craft warships could produce in a coordinated salvo. The combined energy output of that many weapons firing simultaneously was enough to register on sensors 2 systems away. It was, in the documented history of craft military action, the single largest coordinated weapons discharge ever executed in peacetime adjacent conditions. It hit the Everest and did nothing. Not it hit and was absorbed, or hit and deflected. It hit and the Everest continued to exist in exactly the way it had been existing before, unchanged and still, and the light of the strike faded, and the dark came back, and the object was still there. The bridge was very quiet. Grevik looked at the screen for a long time. His communications officer said, "Admiral, another transmission from the primary contact." He said, "Put it through." Admiral Voss's voice said, "I want to show you something, Admiral. Please look at your lateral sensors." He nodded to the sensor officer, who brought up the lateral display. The 11 objects were still in front of him, but on the lateral to the left and right of his fleet's formation, in the space his ships were not watching, because his ships were watching forward. There was movement. Not ships, not weapons, panels, enormous panels opening along the hulls of 3 of the 11 objects, not weapon ports. Grevik had seen weapon ports. They were small, directed, angled for targeting. These were large. They opened like he searched for the word, like doors, like the doors of something that stored things much larger than weapons. He said, "What are those?" Voss said, "Fighter bays. Each of the 11 ships carries between 800 and 1,200 independent fighter class vessels. I am opening 3 bays now so that you can see them. I am not launching." A pause. "I want to be very clear that I am not launching. I want you to be able to report accurately to the Empire about what you saw here." The bays were open, even at distance, even on a sensor display rather than a direct visual. The scale of what was visible inside those openings was wrong, in a way that took a moment to understand. Then it resolved. Each bay was larger than most of the ships in Grevak's fleet. He said, "What do you want, Admiral?" "Voss," she said, "I want the craft Empire to understand what happened today. I want every ship in your fleet to go home and report what they saw. I want your government to understand that the 30-day deliberation period the Council has scheduled is going to end early. I want Voss Creel to go back into that chamber and look at Elder Sin and understand that her patience was not weakness. Pause. I want you personally, Admiral, to understand that you fired everything you had at us. I want you to understand that and carry it with you." Grevek said nothing. Voss said, "You may go, Admiral." He had never been dismissed in his life. Not by anyone. He had been outranked and he had followed orders, but that was different. That was the structure of command which he respected, which made sense. This was different. This was something enormous and patient and unhurt, telling him he could leave. He stayed where he was for a moment. Just a moment. Then he said, "All ships withdraw to Rally Point 7, standard formation." He looked at the screen one more time at the shape that had no edges at the dark. That was not dark, weapons down. As his fleet turned and began to move, he kept the rear sensors active. He watched the 11 objects as his ships pulled away. They did not follow. They did not move at all. They stayed exactly where they were. He thought about what Voss had said. About 200 years of patience, he thought. About the scout ship that had stopped transmitting, not destroyed, just silenced by the weight of what it had seen. He thought about Vash Creel in the council chamber, smiling at the small table near the back. He thought about a human ambassador with a cup of tea and a question that no one had thought to answer. He thought about 500,000 people. He thought about what it would take to make someone build something like this. Not the engineering, not the resources, not the planning, though the planning was staggering and he knew it. He thought about what it would take inside a species, what kind of grief, what kind of long cold fury to look at an open wound and say, "Not yet, not now, we will wait, we will be patient, and we will be quiet, and we will build something that the dark itself cannot hide, and we will wait until the moment is right." 200 years. His fleet moved through the dark, and the 11 objects fell away behind them, and the stars came back one by one as the enormous shape stopped blocking them. And Grevek stood on his bridge and watched the stars return and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle onto him like something physical. Veth appeared at his shoulder. She was quiet for a moment, then she said very carefully, "Sir, they let us fire first." He looked at her. She said, "They knew we would fire. They could have transmitted before we went. Weapons hot. They waited. They let us fire everything we had, and they let it do nothing, and then they transmitted." She paused. "They wanted it on record. Our strike, the result." Grevek looked at the rear sensors. The 11 contacts were still visible, barely at the edge of range. He said, "For the council." Veth said, "Yes, sir." He nodded one small nod. He turned back to face forward toward the rally point, toward home. He said, "Log everything, every sensor reading, every strike coordinate, every response time, full record encrypted. Command priority." Veth said, "Yes, sir." He did not say anything else for a long time. There was not anything useful to say. There was only the dark and the fleet moving through it, and somewhere behind them, in the place where stars were missing from the sky, 11 objects that had been waiting for 200 years. Patient and enormous and completely, utterly unhurt. Waiting. Still waiting. But not, Grevik understood now, for much longer. The log files were not classified. That was the first thing Admiral Voss had done when she took command of the Everest. She had gone into the ship's archive system, found the personal logs of the construction workers, and removed every classification tag from every file. 31,000 hours of recordings. Voices from people who had spent there. Lives in the dark building, something they would never see used. She had read the index on her first night aboard and had not slept much after that. She read 1 log per day. That was her rule, 1 per day. In the morning before the bridge briefing, she had been doing it for 8 months. This morning she read Petra Vassal. Log entry, day 4211. Engineer Petra Vassal, section lead. Structural Interior Division, Project Q. ITSTONE. I don't do these often anymore. Used to do them every week when I was younger, and thought someone would listen to them. Eventually, now I do them when something happens worth saying out loud. We finished the secondary load-bearing spine today, the whole thing, all 900 km. Of it took us 14 years. I had to say that again because I don't think I'll ever say a sentence like that again in my life. 14 years, 900 km. The crew threw a small party in Bay 12. Someone had saved real coffee for the occasion, actual ground coffee. I don't know how they got it out here, and we drank it out of vacuum-safe cups, and someone played music on a portable speaker, and we all just stood there in this enormous dark space inside a dead planet and drank coffee and didn't talk much. There's not much to say at moments like that. You either feel it or you don't. I've been on Quistis for 31 years now. I came out here when I was 26. I am 57 years old, and I have spent more of my life inside this gas giant than I have spent on any planet with open sky. My daughter was born in Section 14. Medical, she's 19 now, and she works in hull calibration 3 sections over. And I see her on Sundays. I think about the people who will fly this ship sometimes. I don't know their names. I don't know when it will be. The project leads tell us it won't be in my lifetime, and I believe them. We're maybe a third done, if that. So I think about strangers. I think about some young officer who wasn't born yet, standing on a bridge I built the floor supports for, looking out at something I will never see. I hope they know what it took. I hope when the moment comes, whatever the moment is, I don't know what it will be. I just know that there will be a moment, because they wouldn't be building this if there wasn't going to be a moment. I hope when it comes, whoever is standing on that bridge feels the weight of all of us behind them, not as a burden, as a foundation. 31 years, 900 km, 1 spine. We're not done yet. Voss closed the file. She sat in her chair for the bridge outside her office window was running the morning cycle, low lights, quiet stations, the gentle hum of 11 planet-sized warships holding position. In the dark, through the main forward port, she could see nothing. They were running without external lights. They had always run without external lights. She thought about Petra Vassal standing in Bay 12 with a cup of real coffee, 57 years old, gray in the dark, and she thought about the spine of this ship, 900 km of it, running through the Everest *S interior like a backbone, and she thought, I'm standing on what you Built. She closed the file. She went to the bridge. It was time. Project QSTDONE had begun 203 years ago in a basement meeting room in Geneva with 11 people. And no paperwork. No paperwork was the point. No paperwork meant no record. No record meant nothing. To find the 11 people in that room had looked at the political situation. Clearly, humanity was registered with the Galactic Council. Humanity was considered harmless. Humanity had been laughed at twice in council chambers already and had been occupying the small table near the column for 6 years, and they had asked a single question. What happens when laughing stops being enough for them? They had not needed to name who asterisk them was. Everyone in the room had the same list. The answer they arrived at after 3 days of argument was this: when that moment comes, we cannot win conventionally. We are too small, too new, too far behind on every measurable military scale. Conventional means catching up. Catching up takes time and money, and most importantly, it takes visibility. Because cannot build a fleet without someone noticing, and the moment someone notices humanity is building a serious military, the moment that information reaches the wrong ears, the moment becomes now, whether we are ready or not. So they did not catch up. They disappeared. QITSDONE's first directive was silence, not secrecy. Secrecy implied someone was looking and you were hiding. Silence meant removing yourself so completely from the observable record that no one had any reason to look. Humanity's registered fleet stayed small and politely Tier 3. Their weapons development reports stayed accurate and unimpressive. Their council contributions stayed minor and grateful. They smiled at the right moments and thanked the right delegates and sat at the small table and drank whatever the local equivalent of tea was and caused no trouble. And in the dark they built. The locations were chosen by a team that spent 4 years doing nothing but study galactic scanner technology, not to defeat it but to understand it completely, to know exactly what it could and could not see, to find the blind spots that existed not because of failure but because of assumption. Scanners looked for engine signatures, weapon heat, metal density, electromagnetic output. They looked for the thing ships produced because ships were the thing anyone was building. So humanity did not build ships. They built inside things that already existed, dead stars hollowed carefully. Over decades, their interiors converted centimeter by centimeter into structural space. Gas giant, their cores accessed through tunnels drilled by machines that ran cold and produced no meaningful heat. Signature asteroid clusters used as camouflage around construction sites, where the background scatter was indistinguishable from natural debris. They did not use standard building materials where standard materials could be scanned. They developed alternatives. Over 30 years of quiet research. Alloys that read as natural rock formations too. Every scanner type currently in use. Whole composites that had the electromagnetic signature of dead space. Engine systems that ran on principles the galactic community had not developed, because the galactic community had not needed to hide. When you build something in secret for 200 years, you get very good at the thing you are building. You also get very good at things you did not expect. To get good at material science, energy, containment, drive systems, weapons, Physics because you have no one to buy these things from, no catalog to order, from no established supplier. You have to make everything yourself. And making everything yourself from scratch with no shortcuts and no standard options turns out to produce results that cannot be purchased anywhere in the known galaxy because no one else had the reason to develop them. The Everest was the largest. It had taken 140 years to build inside the corpse of a brown dwarf that had been drifting cold and dead in the uncharted dark between two map sectors. The workers who built it were the children and grandchildren of the workers who started it. Some of them had never seen open sky. The Everest was the only world they had known, and they had built it with their hands in their whole lives, and they had never told anyone. Not once in 200 years, not one person broke silence. That was the part that Vass found the most remarkable on the days she let herself think about it. Not the engineering, not the scale, not the weapon systems, which were generations ahead of anything the Council had seen. Not because humanity was inherently more brilliant, but because humanity had spent 200 years with no option but to be brilliant. What she found remarkable was the human part of it. 31,000 hours of personal logs told the story of ordinary people, engineers and welders and medics and teachers for the children born in the dark who understood what they were part of and chose every day to keep choosing it. They had never met the people they were building for. They built anyway. They had never known the specific threat they were building against. They built anyway. They had known, most of them, that they would die inside the thing they were building and never see it leave. They built anyway. Engineer Petra Vassal had died 11 before the Everest launched. She had died in Section 14 Medical, the same section where her daughter had been born from a heart condition that the doctors had seen coming for 2 years. She was 71. Her daughter had been with her. Her log files had been submitted to the archive 6 weeks before her death, neatly labeled, every entry dated and indexed. Her last entry was 47 words long. Voss had read it on her 3rd day of reading logs. She had read it again this morning after Petra's longer entry, before she went to the bridge. It said, "I won't see it finished, that's all. Right. The people who finish it will be better than us for having something to finish, leave them something worth finishing. We did that. I think we did that." On the bridge, the morning briefing was straightforward. The craft fleet had withdrawn to their point and was holding position there. No aggressive movement, no further communications from Vash Creel or from any craft military authority. The Council had received Grev Axe's initial report, a fragmented emergency transmission, heavy on sensor data, light on words, and the Council chamber had, according to Dara Sen's aide, Torin, gone extremely quiet for a long time. Vash stood at the main display and looked at the positional map. 11 blue markers her fleet in their holding position, a cluster of smaller red markers at the Krath rally point, and at the center of the map, Vethara Station, where the Council was sitting in a chamber that smelled like every species, at once doing what governments do when something happens that all their models said was impossible, trying to find the category for it. Her first officer, a tall, quiet man named Dale, who had been with her for 9 years and who communicated most of his opinions through the precise angle of his eyebrows was standing beside. Sir. His eyebrows said, "What now?" She said, "We hold." He said, "The council will want communication." She said, "They will want more than that. They will want an explanation and a threat assessment and a political framework and probably an apology for disrupting their schedule." She looked at the map. "Elder Sen will give them what they need. That's her job." Dale said, "In hours." She looked at the 11 blue markers, 11 ships named after the high places of Earth, the peaks, the mountains, the points where the ground reached up toward the sky: Everest, Kilimanjaro, Olympus, Denali, Aconcagua, Elbrus, Vincennes, Puncak Jaya, Mont Blanc, Logan, Kanchenjunga. Someone in the naming committee 200 years ago had thought carefully about that. High places, things that had been there before anyone climbed them and would be there after. She said, "Our job is to exist. That's enough for now. We just have to exist and let them understand what that means." Dale's eyebrows moved slightly. Agreement or close to it. She thought about Petra Vassal in Bay 12 with her cup of coffee. She thought about 31 years and 900 km and a spine that ran the length of this ship like a promise kept across generations. She thought about the young officer Petra had imagined, the stranger on the bridge, the one not yet born. She was that officer now. And GT snorts. And GT, older than Petra had probably imagined. Grayer, more tired in the particular way of people who have carried something for a long time and have not yet put it down, but standing on the foundation. She looked at the forward port. Still dark out there, still no lights on the hull. 11 enormous shapes in the uncharted space, visible only by the stars they hid, patient and silent and enormously, almost incomprehensibly present. She said to no one in particular, to Dale or to the bridge or to the 31,000 hours of voices in the archive below her feet, "We made it." No one answered. There was not a right answer to that. There was only the hum of the ship in the dark outside, and somewhere far away a council chamber full of alien delegates trying to find a category for something that had been in the dark for 200 years and was now finally done waiting. Her communications officer said, "Admiral, incoming transmission from Vithara Station. It is Elder Sin." Voss said, "Put her through." The voice that came over the channel was calm as it always was. There was something new in it, though, not excitement, not triumph, something quieter than those things. Something that sounded like what a person sounds like when they have been holding their breath for a very long time and have just carefully let it out. Dara Sin said, "Mara, they are ready to talk." Voss said, "How many of them?" A pause. Sin said, "All of them." Voss looked at the map, at the 11 blue markers, at the cluster of red ones still in holding. She said, "Tell them we will be there in 6 hours. She closed the channel. She stood at the display for a moment, then she turned to Dale and said, "Set a course for Vithara Station, best speed." She paused and put the lights on. Dale's eyebrows moved. This time it was not a subtle movement. He said, "All ships." She said, "All ships." For the first time in 200 years, the fleet ran with its lights on. In the dark of uncharted space, 11 shapes that had existed in silence and shadow since before anyone alive had been born lit up all at once, running lights along whole lines that went on for hundreds of kilometers, illumination that caught the geometry of things too large for the mind to hold, easily, light spilling across metal that had never seen light from outside. From a distance, if anyone had been watching, it would have looked like 11 new stars had appeared in a part of the sky that had always been empty. They moved toward Vithara Station. They were not hiding anymore. The council chamber had been built to handle crises. That was the official purpose of the emergency configuration. The way the seats locked into forward position, the way the secondary lighting came on along the floor so the room stayed readable. Even if someone cut the main power, the way the resonance plate could be struck 3 times in a specific pattern to seal the doors and prevent anyone from leaving until the session concluded. The architects who designed the hall 400 years ago had thought about riots, about species that disagreed badly, enough to come to blows in the chamber itself, about the worst version of a bad day. They had not thought about this. The chamber was full. Every delegation had returned, even the ones who had quietly begun preparing their ships for fast departure 2 hours ago when Grevik sensor data started circulating on the private council channels. They had come back not because they felt safe, but because leaving felt worse. Leaving meant you were not in the room where things were decided. Leaving meant things got decided without you. Whatever was happening, you wanted to be inside it rather than outside it trying to guess. So they were all there. 2,000 people in a curved room that smelled like every species at once, and the room was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before, because quiet in the council chamber usually meant people were thinking about what to say next. And this quiet meant people were thinking about something much larger than that and finding the thinking difficult. The main display at the front of the chamber, usually used for maps, treaty document, statistical projections, was showing a live sensor feed from the array at the edge of the Sevri drift. It showed 11 lights moving through the dark. They had been watching it for 2 hours. The lights were enormous even on the display, which was calibrated for objects up to the size of a standard space station. The calibration had broken down early. Someone had manually rescaled the display 3 times. The lights kept not fitting. Osik sat at the chair's position at the center of the room and looked at the display and said nothing. He had been chair for 6 years. He had handled trade disputes and border conflicts and 2 genuine shooting incidents between registered species. He had a process for most things. He did not have a process for this. His aide leaned over and whispered that Elder Sin had arrived at the station and was requesting entry to the chamber. Osik said, "Let her in." Dara Sin came through the east entrance. Alone, she was still wearing the same dark blue with the gold collar stripe she had worn to the morning session. She had not changed. She walked down the central aisle toward the front table. Not the small table near the column, the front table, the one reserved for parties presenting formal cases, and she sat down. No one said anything about the table. She put her communicator on the table in front of her and folded her hands and looked at Osik. Osik said, "Elder Sin, the council has been reviewing Fleet Admiral Grevik's sensor transmission." She said, "I know." He said, "The objects in the transmission, the 11 contacts." He Paused, he was choosing words very carefully, the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground. They are human vessels. She said they are. The room made a sound, not a word, a collective exhalation, the sound of 2,000 people processing a confirmation they had already suspected but had been quietly hoping was wrong. Osik said, their scale is. He stopped. He tried again. The mass readings indicate. He stopped again. He looked at her. How? It was not really a question about engineering. He was not asking about materials or construction methods or propulsion systems. He was asking something older than that. He was asking the thing that everyone in the room was asking, the thing underneath all the political analysis and the threat assessments and the frantic whispered consultations happening in every delegation cluster in the room. He was asking, how did we not know? How did we sit in this room with you for 200 years and not know? Darrison said, we were quiet. Osric looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, you will need to give the council more than that. She said, I know I will, but first I need to ask the council something. She looked around the room slowly, the same way she had looked around the morning session, actually looking, meeting eyes, acknowledging each presence, but it was different now. In the morning session, it had been a diplomat's technique, measured and deliberate. Now it was something else. Now it was a woman who had spent her whole career in this room, looking at the people she had spent her whole career in this room with, and the look had a way to it that was not unkind but was very, very clear. I need to ask the council why no one ever asked. The room was quiet. She said, we filed our resource reports on time every year for 200 years. We filed our fleet registration. We filed our technology assessments. We filed everything the compact required us to file. She paused. The gaps were there. They were always there. Resources went into registered manifests and did not come out as registered products. Energy consumption at certain coordinates exceeded what our declared operations could account for. We were not perfect. We were careful, but we were not perfect. And any species in this room with a serious intelligence operation could have looked at our filings and found the gaps. She let that sit for a moment. No one looked, she said. I want the council to think about why that is. The room did not like that. The room shifted, the particular restless movement of 2,000 people who have just been told something uncomfortable and are trying to find a position where it is less uncomfortable. Several delegates began speaking at once. ASIC struck the resonance plate twice and the voices settled. The Draxi cluster's senior delegate, six-limbed creature named Asath Vel, who had been on the council longer than ASIC, and who had the particular confidence of someone who had outlasted many difficult conversations, said, Elder Sin, you are implying negligence on the part of the council. Dara Sin said, I'm implying assumption. There is a difference. She looked at Asath Vel directly. The council assumed humanity was small, so the council looked at humanity's filings the way you look at a small thing's filings, quickly, without much attention, because small things do not require much attention. The gaps were invisible, not because we hid them perfectly, but because no one was looking carefully enough to see them. She paused. We relied on that. I will not pretend otherwise. Asath Vel said, That is a sophisticated strategy for a species that has been registered for 2 centuries without incident. She said yes. A pause. It took us a long time to develop it. She said, we are patient people. Vashkreel had not spoken since the session opened. He had sat at the craft table front row, right of center, with his hands flat on the table's surface and his eyes forward, and he had listened to everything. His expression had not changed. It was the expression of someone who had decided that expression was a resource, not to be spent carelessly. He stood up now. Asik acknowledged him. Vashkreel said, the craft empire's position on the territorial adjustment claim remains unchanged. The claim was filed under Article 9. It was legal. The Earth Coalition's response. He paused. Something passed across his face. Small thing quickly controlled is a matter for legal review. The room was very quiet. Darrison looked at him. She did not say anything. She looked at him the way you look at something you have been waiting to see for a long time, the way you look at a moment you prepared for so thoroughly that arriving in it feels almost ordinary. She looked at him with complete, settled patience and said nothing at all. Vashkreel sat down. It happened without drama. He stood, he spoke, she looked at him, and he sat down. No threat was made. No words were exchanged. The 11 lights on the display behind her did not move or flash or do anything demonstrative. She simply looked at him with the full weight of 200 years of quiet behind her eyes, and he sat down. The room noticed. The room had been watching Vashkreel for the entire session with the particular attention of people who know that the most dangerous person in the room and the most recently dangerous person in the room are about to have an interaction, and the room had expected something, an argument, a formal challenge, a political maneuver of some kind. It had not expected him to simply sit down. The quiet that followed was different from the quiet before. It had a texture to it that took a moment to identify. Relief was part of it, but underneath the relief was something else, something that every delegate in the room was feeling individually, and that none of them had words for yet. It was the feeling of the world reorganizing itself, not violently, not with a crash, just a slow, firm settling into a new configuration, the way a building settles after the ground shifts, everything still standing, but nothing in quite the same relationship to anything else as it had been before. Asik said, Elder Sin, what is the Earth Coalition requesting from this council? She said 3 things. She laid them out simply. Her voice did not rise. She did not perform the words. She said them the way you state facts, flatly, clearly, without decoration. First, the Krath Empire would withdraw the territorial adjustment claim under Article 9 and submit to a full council review of the events at Reach 7 and Reach 8. The review would be conducted by a neutral panel. The Earth Coalition would provide full sensor records of both colony destructions. The panel would determine appropriate reparations, which the Krath Empire would pay in full, and a timeline for the rebuilding of both colonies, which the Krath Empire would fund. Second, the Earth Coalition would be granted a permanent seat at the Council's head table with full voting rights equal to the 5 largest species currently registered, effective immediately. Third, a new clause would be added to the Galactic Compact. It would be called the Reach Clause after the colonies. It would state in simple language that not be interpreted flexibly, that any deliberate destruction of a civilian settlement belonging to any registered species would constitute an act of war against the full council, and that the council's response would be total and immediate. She said, "These are not negotiations. I am not offering a starting position. These are the terms." The room was quiet for a long time. Asafvel said, "Elder Sin, you understand that some of these terms, particularly the second, represent a significant restructuring of." She said, "I understand." He said, "The council will need time to deliberate." She said, "I will give the council until tomorrow morning." He said, "That is not." She said, "I know." She looked at the display behind her, the 11 lights moving slowly through the dark toward Vethara Station. She looked at them for a moment, and then she looked back at the room. Tomorrow morning. The deliberation took 4 hours. It was the shortest deliberation in council history by a significant margin. Most of it was not spent arguing about humanity's terms. The terms were what they were, and everyone in the room understood that terms backed by 11 planet-sized warships 6 hours away were not really terms at all in the conventional sense. Most of the 4 hours was spent on the K-Wrath, because the K-Wrath had a choice to make. And the choice was this: agree to the review and the reparations, which was humiliating, or refuse and invite a response from something that Grevex's entire fleet had fired everything at and produced no result. Vash Creel consulted with the K-Wrath capital through an encrypted channel for 2 hours. He returned to the chamber with the expression of someone who has had a difficult conversation and has decided to be professional about it. He agreed to the review. After that, the rest moved quickly. The Reach Clause generated some argument. 3 delegations wanted modifications to the language, 2 wanted exemptions. For contested territories, 1 wanted a longer implementation timeline. Darrison sat at the front table and listened to all of it, and then said that the language was not open to modification and the timeline was immediate, and the exemptions were not on the table. Each time the room looked at the display, each time the argument ended. When the vote came, ASEC called it in the standard way, species in order of registration date, each casting a recorded vote. It went around the room. 11 species, every one of them said yes. Unanimous. ASEC struck the resonance plate once. 1 strike, which meant a resolution had passed, and the sound moved through the hall and settled. It was done. Darrison sat at the front table and did not show anything on her face for a long moment. Then she picked up her communicator and sent a single short message to the Everest asterisk. It said, "Done, all 3, unanimous." The response came back in under a minute. It said, "Understood, see you soon." Chicory Vass appeared at the edge of Darrison's table. The Veloxy ambassador was small enough that she had to stand close to the table to be at eye level with Sen, who was seated. She stood there for a moment, her many-jointed hands folded in front of her, her compound eyes catching the light. She said very quietly, "We always wondered." Darrison looked at her. Something moved across her face, not a smile exactly. Something quieter than a smile. Something that came from a very deep place. She said, "We know." Chikuriva said, "We never asked because." She paused. She was choosing words the way you choose words when the real words are too large for the sentence. We thought perhaps if we asked and you told us, we would be obligated to tell others, and we did not want to be obligated to tell others. She was quiet. For a moment. "We hoped you were building something." Met Dorcason said, "Thank you for not asking." Chikurivas unfolded her hands and nodded once, which in Veloxy body language meant something close to, "We are even now, and I am glad." Then she turned and went back to the Veloxy table, which was at the far left, and sat in her elevated seat and looked straight ahead. Dorcason looked at the display one more time. The 11 lights were closer now, moving steadily, unhurried. She thought about Mara Vass on the bridge of the Everest asterisk, reading Petra Vass logs every morning, carrying the weight of 31,000 hours of voices. She thought about the border scout that had gone quiet at the edge of craft space. 2 crew members looking at their screen and finding no words. She thought about Vash sitting down. She thought about Reach 7, about 412,000 people who had grown grain and raised children and eaten dinner with their families and were not here anymore. She thought, it is not enough, it will never be enough, but it is what we can do, and we have done it. She picked up her communicator. She called Torin, her aide, who was waiting in the corridor outside. When he answered, she said, "Get me a tea, please, whatever they have here." He said, "Yes, Elder Sin, is it? Did it go?" She said, "It went." A pause, then he said, and his voice had something in it that was young and very genuine. "All 3. She said, "All 3. She heard him exhale. She sat at the front table, not the small table near the column anymore, not ever again. And she waited for her tea, and she listened to the room around her slowly begin to find its voice again. 2,000 people talking in the careful way of people who have just watched the world reorganize itself and are trying to figure out where everything is now. Outside, 6 hours away, 11 lights move through the dark. Steady, patient. Done waiting. 1 year was not very long in the history of the Galactic Council. 1 year was barely a breath. Treaties took decades. Reparation frameworks took generations. The bureaucratic machinery of 11 species agreeing on anything moved with the speed of something that had learned over centuries. That speed was how you made mistakes that lasted forever. And yet, in 1 year, the craft empire had withdrawn from the Sevri drift completely, not slowly, not with the dragged reluctance of a species buying time. They had moved their installations and their personnel and their administrative structures out of the 2 contested sectors in 91 days, which was fast enough that the Council's neutral observers had barely kept pace with the withdrawal. Vash Creel had not attended the formal signing of the withdrawal documentation. He had sent a deputy. The deputy had signed without comment and left without staying for the reception. In 1 year, the neutral review panel had completed its work on Reach 7 and Reach 8. The report was 400 pages long and contained, among other things, a detailed accounting of every life lost, every structure destroyed, every crop field burned from orbit. It used careful language because careful language was what the panel was trained to produce. The careful language did not change what the numbers said. The reparations figure had been calculated by the panel and was the largest single reparation payment in Council history by a factor of 8. The craft had paid the first installment in 60 days, which was earlier than required. No one had commented on that. In 1 year, the rebuilding of both colonies had begun. The first ships carrying construction materials and prefabricated housing reached the Savory Drift 7 months after the council vote. The settlement teams came 4 months after that. Reach 7 had new ground broken on its first township with a ceremony that was small and quiet and attended mostly by the families of people who had lived there before, people who had been off colony when it happened, people who had the particular kind of grief that came from surviving something your community did not. They planted a marker at the center of the township site. It listed every name, all 412,840. Reach 8's marker listed 89,217. Both markers were made of the same dark metal as the hull of the Everest. Asterisk, that had been Vass's suggestion. No one had argued with it. In 1 year, the queue of species requesting formal alliance with the Earth Coalition had grown to 37. 37 species, ranging from minor registered members with 2 or 3 systems to mid-tier powers with significant resources and histories that went back centuries, had submitted formal alliance inquiries to the Earth Coalition Diplomatic Office. The office, which had previously occupied a single floor of a mid-sized building in Geneva and been staffed by 40 people, had moved to a new facility 4 times the size and was still running behind. Darasin had approved 11 alliances so far, the rest were under review. She was taking her time. 1 year, she said at a staff meeting, that Torvin wrote up and filed carefully, was not very long. There was no reason to hurry. She was sitting at the head table now. Not the small table near the column, the head table front and center, where you could see every face in the room without leaning. She had sat there for 11 months and it still felt, occasionally, like something that belonged to someone else. She sat there anyway. She sat there until the feeling went away, and it was going away slowly, but it was going away. Torvin brought her tea every morning. Without being asked now, he had learned her preferences exactly: temperature, steeping time, the specific variety she liked that was difficult to source on Vithara Station because it came from a small farm in Sri Lanka and had to be shipped in. He sourced it. She had not asked him to. He had simply begun doing it quietly as a fact. She thought sometimes that Torvin would be good at this job in 20 years. She was teaching him without meaning to, the way you teach people when you stop explaining things and just do them in front of someone who is paying attention. She hoped he would be better at it then. Sorry. She hoped there would not be a reason for him to be as good at it as her. Admiral Moraves was walking the hull of the Everest asterisk, not inside the hull, outside it, in a suit tethered, moving along the exterior surface at roughly the pace of a person who was not going anywhere specific and had no deadline. The suit was standard EVA issue, gray, and unremarkable, with a faceplate that showed her the stars on all sides and the hull surface below her boots, dark metal, slightly textured, running away from her in all directions further than she could see clearly. She did this once a month. She had done It's 7 times now, the crew knew about it and had stopped mentioning it, which she appreciated. Dale had asked once, early on, whether she wanted a security detail for the walks. She had said no. He had not asked again. She walked. The Everest was in geosynchronous orbit above Earth's moon. All 11 ships were there, a semicircle of enormous shapes visible from Earth's surface at night as something between stars and not stars. Things that did not quite twinkle and did not quite move but were unmistakably present in the sky in a way that had taken people about 2 weeks to get used to, and then had simply become part of what the night sky looked like. Children born in the last year would grow up thinking the sky had always looked like that. Voss thought about that sometimes, about children who would never know the sky without them. She walked along the hall and thought about Petra Vassal. She did this every walk. She thought about Petra specifically, not the 31,000 hours of archive, not the project leads, or the section chiefs or the engineers, whose names appeared on structural documents, but Petra, standing in Bay 12, with a cup of real coffee, 57 years old, looking at 900 km of finished work, and feeling something that she had tried to describe in a log entry and had not quite found the words for. The feeling underneath the words. The feeling that Voss had been trying to name for 7 months of morning readings. She thought she had it now. It was not pride. Pride was too small and too personal for what Petra had been feeling. It was not satisfaction, which was also too small. It was something that had no clean word in any language. Voss knew the feeling of having done a thing that needed doing and having done it fully and having been one of the people who did it and knowing that the thing would outlast you and being at peace with that, being more than at peace with it, being glad. Petra had been glad standing in Bay 12 with her coffee, with the finished spine of the ship running 900 km around her. She had been glad, not happy. Happy was whether it came and went. Glad was geology. It sat in you like bedrock below the weather, below everything that changed. Voss thought, I'm also glad. She walked below her through the hall she was walking on. 17,000 crew ran their shifts and ate their meals and slept in their bunks and did the 1,000 ordinary things that kept something this large operational. Above her the stars. To her left the moon, gray and pocked and beautiful in the way of old things that have taken a lot of hits and are still here. To her right, at the edge of her peripheral vision, the curved edge of earth, blue and white and green, small. From here, small the way all precious things look small when you get enough distance to see them whole. Her communicator chimed softly. She looked at the sender, Dara Shen. She opened the channel. She said, Dara. Shen's voice came through clean and warm. You're doing the walk. How did you know? Because Dale answered when I called the bridge and sounded slightly relieved. When I asked for you, he always sounds slightly relieved when you're on the walk. I think it means he gets to run things for an hour and he likes it. Voss made a sound that was close to a laugh. She said, what do you need? Sin said, nothing urgent. I wanted to tell you that the Veloxy have submitted a formal alliance request. Voss stopped walking. She stood still on the hull of the Everest and looked at the stars and let that land. The Veloxy, who had noticed the gaps for 200 years and said nothing, who had hoped without asking, who had protected humanity's secret by the simple act of never wanting to know it officially. She said, "When did it come in?" Sin said, "This morning, no fanfare. Just a formal document, standard format. Submitted through the regular queue." Pause. They put themselves at the back of the queue, 37th. They did not want special treatment. Voss said, "Of course they didn't." A pause. Then Sin said, and her voice had something in it that was very quiet and very old, "I think they've been waiting to ask for a long time, I think. They were waiting until they were sure we were going to be all right." Voss looked at the earth, small and whole and still there. She said, "Move them to the front." Sin said, "I was going to." The holding cell on deck 14 of the Everest was not uncomfortable. That was the first thing the craft soldier had noticed 3 weeks ago when they had put him there. He had been part of a border installation in the Sevri Drift, Junior. Rank signals monitoring, 22 years old. When the withdrawal orders came through, he had been on a solo patrol run and had not received them in time and had crossed into the new boundary marker by mistake and been picked up by an Earth coalition patrol before he understood what was happening. His name was Ritskov. He had been in the craft military for 2 years. He had not been at Reach 7 or Reach 8. He had been stationed at the border installation for 8 months, running calibration checks on long-range scanners, eating bad food, missing his mother, doing his job. The cell was a small room with a bunk and a chair and a light that dimmed at night on a cycle that he had started using to track time. The door had a window in it. He could see the corridor. Outside, sometimes crew members walked past. Most of them did not look at him. Some did, quick glances held for a moment, then away. He could not read human expressions well. Their faces were too mobile, too much happening in them at once, but he had been looking at the glances for 3 weeks, and he thought that most of them were not anger. Some were curiosity. Some were something he did not have a word for in craft, a kind of careful looking that was not hostile. He did not know what to do with that. This morning a crew member had come to his door at what he had calculated was the meal hour, a young woman, human, with short dark hair and the rank insignia of a junior crew rating on her collar. She had a tray, standard meal tray, the kind he had seen slid through the door slot every day for 3 weeks. But she did not slide it through the slot. She opened the door. He had sat up on the bunk immediately. Instinct, hands visible, the way you moved when a door opened unexpectedly. She had looked at him and then at the tray, and then she had walked in and put the tray on the chair, not the slot, the chair where he could reach it properly. And she had stood there for a moment. He did not know what she was going to do. He did not know what he was supposed to do. He had no training for this specific situation. His training covered a great many things, and this was not one of them. She had looked at him for a moment. Her face was doing something that he had been looking at for long enough now to make a guess about. He thought it might be the thing that happened on a face when a person was deciding something and had decided it. She put the tray on the chair. She left. She did not explain. She did not say anything. She just left him with the tray on the chair instead of in the slot, which was a small thing, which was a thing that cost her nothing, which was a thing she had not needed to do and had done anyway. He sat on the bunk and looked at the tray on the chair for a long time. He ate the food. It was not bad. It was not good either. It was food made for humans, and he was not a human, and some of it tasted like nothing he had a reference for, but he ate it. 3 weeks ago, if someone had told him he would be eating food made by humans on a human ship the size of a planet, while waiting for a diplomatic process to determine whether he would be released or charged, he did not know what he would have done. He had not been given enough information about humans in his training to have a strong reaction. They were a small species. They were not considered a threat. They were not covered in depth. He was revising that. He thought about the crew member with the tray. He thought about the fact that she had opened the door, which she had not been required to do, and had put the tray where he could reach it properly, which she had not been required to do, and had not said anything, which was either because she had nothing to say or because she understood that the action was the thing and the words would have made it smaller. He thought about that for a long time. Outside the window in the cell door, crew members moved through the corridor in both directions, running their shifts, living their lives on this enormous ship named after a mountain on a planet he had never visited. He thought about what it took to build something like this and keep it secret for 200 years, and he thought about the settlement names on the council records that he had been required to review as part of his general briefing when he first arrived at the border installation. And he thought about what it meant that the people who had built this ship and kept the secret and lost those colonies had put him in a room that was not uncomfortable and sent a young woman to put a tray on a chair. He did not have a word for what he was feeling. Krath's emotional vocabulary was not built for this specific combination of things. He ate the food. He thought, these are not a small species. He thought they never were. Voss finished her walk as the earth turned slowly below and the moon held its place and the stars did what they always did, burned quietly at distances that made every human problem feel small, and every human act of patience feel somehow exactly the right size. She came back inside through the EVA airlock and took off her helmet and handed it to the waiting tech and walked toward the bridge. Dale was at the command position. He saw her come in and moved back to his own station with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been running things competently and was not going to make anything of it. She appreciated that about him. She had always appreciated that about him. She stood at the main display. The positional map showed the fleet in orbit, 11 blue markers steady and close. The Earth below, the moon, the steady, ordinary business of a system that had people in it going about their lives. She thought about Petra Vassal. She thought about what Petra had been glad about standing in Bay 12, and she thought about what she herself was glad about standing here, and she thought about the young craft soldier in the cell on deck 14 eating food off a tray placed on a chair by a crew member who had not needed to open the door. She thought, we built it because we refused to disappear. We built it because there were children in Reach 7 and children in Reach 8 and children not yet born in colonies not yet built who deserved to exist in a galaxy that could not simply decide one day that they were small enough to burn. We built it because patience was the only weapon we had for a long time, and patience turned out to be enough. She thought, Petra, we made it. The bridge ran its quiet cycle around her. The stars outside were the same stars they had always been, the same Stars the first workers had looked at. From inside a dead brown dwarf, and the same stars the crew member with the tray would look at tonight from her bunk window, and the same stars that Riskov could not quite see from his cell, but that were out there anyway. The same stars, everything else different. She said to Dale, "What's on the schedule?" He said, "Council briefing at 900. Alliance review session at 1400. Elder Sin wants a call at 1700. A pause, and the Veluxy ambassador has requested a tour of the Everest. Asterisk. Voss looked at the display. She said, "Schedule the tour for tomorrow morning. Give her as long as she wants." She paused. She said, "And make sure someone shows her Bay 12. Dale said, "Bay 12 specifically." She said, "Tell her that's where we had the coffee." He looked at her for a moment. His eyebrows said a question. She said, "She'll understand when she gets there." She turned to face forward, toward the stars, toward whatever came next, which was not war anymore, and was not hiding anymore, and was not the long cold patience of 2 centuries of silence. What came next was something they did not have a full plan for yet, which was fine. They had time now. They had the kind of time that comes when the thing you spent everything preparing for has happened, and you are still here, and the galaxy knows your name, and you can finally, for the first time in 200 years, simply exist in it. Out loud. They had time. They had built something worth the time. Below the Everest asterisk, the Earth turned. Above it the stars burned. In the orbit between world and sky, 11 ships the size of small mountains held their place in the dark. Steady. Patient. Home.